Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the 20 classic books that I want to read by the end of 2022. Will I succeed in reading these? Maybe, maybe not, but hopefully I will, because these are all books that I want to read at least relatively soon. Maybe if not in 2022, then at least by the beginning of 2023. And the first one is actually a reread. That is Dune by Frank Herbert. This is a book I read about 4 or so years ago, and I grew up with the 80s miniseries, and I always thought that was hilarious, but so over the top. But I also never liked the book. I read it, I disliked it, I never want to go back, but I've realized that now I have a lot more understanding of sci-fi and fantasy as genres, as well as reading more books that are dense and that I have to take my time with. So I want to give this book a second chance. Next one is Utopia by Sir Thomas More. This is a satire on the idea of a utopia. A lot of people don't realize that about Utopia. They'll read this book and say, oh yeah, this is completely the perfect world that Thomas More thought the world should be. No, he was making fun of the ideal world that everyone thought should exist. Last month, I finished a biography of Thomas More, and I've read several other books by Thomas More or about him, and I really want to just read this book because I have had this book on my TBR for years, and I've wanted to read it since I discovered Thomas More maybe like 8 years ago, and I have not read it yet. So I feel like this year I have to read it. Next one is Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. I have also wanted to read Nietzsche for a long time, and even though I don't think I'll agree with Nietzsche in many ways, he is a philosopher that is highly influential even to this day. I own a couple books by him, but this one is considered one of his greatest works. It's probably also his most popular work, and it's also extremely short. So I really want to try to read this year. The next one is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. This is a book, Shelley Swearingen did not like this book when she read it, so I'm curious to see if I'll like it if I read it, because I do remember trying to start this book and I only got a chapter in before I just was not in the mood to read it. This book is considered, I believe, to be his best, so I want to read this book, and because, again, I've had it on my TBR for a long time. The next one is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. I grew up with the movie adaptation that came out in the 70s, I believe. And I didn't even know that The Last Unicorn was based on a book until I found this at, I think, the Goodwill or some thrift bookstore that I go to. And I've been wanting to read this since I found it, especially since it is more of a children's book. It's very easy to read, low reading level. All right, the next one, and I own this in a 2-volume set, is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I've talked about how much I love Wilkie Collins. The Woman in White is one of my favorite Victorian classics. However, I have not read this book. Considering it is considered to be the first detective novel, I don't know why I have never bothered to read it, because I love mysteries. I've read Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. I often go on about how much I love historical mysteries, and yet I have not read this. And I feel like this year, I guess in the next 6 months, that needs to be rectified. Recently, I've been getting into more of ancient works and authors, so the next one is in that vein with Lives of the Caesars by Sutonius? He lived during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, about 70 CE he was born. Interesting. But basically, he wrote a documentation of the lives of the Caesars, but apparently this is less of a biography and more of characterization of the emperors. And I've read about this book referenced in a lot of other books, historical works, and it's made me really want to read it. And I've owned this book for a while, and I haven't gotten around to reading it yet, so I really want to read it this year. The next one is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Call Me Ishmael. This is another one I've had on my TBR for years, and I haven't read it, and I really want to read it this year. Especially since most of the ones that I picked here specifically, I know that I can get from my library on audiobook, and I've been going through a lot more books, especially tough classic books on audiobook, because a lot of the print in classics books is very small. It's very dense to read. And so I really struggle, and I have to take my time with bigger classics like this. But with audiobooks, I can go a lot quicker. So I really want to read this book this year about a whale and a man. It sounds incredibly boring, but it's a book I really want to read. And this year, I've really gotten to Pearl S. Buck. I read The Good Earth a year or two ago, and then I read Imperial Woman earlier this year, and I want to read Pavilion of Women now. And I have no idea what this is about, but it's another Pearl S. Buck book, and I've owned it for as long as I've owned Imperial Woman, and I really want to read this one now. The next one is Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham? I believe this book is part autobiography, part fiction about this author's life and exploration of different philosophies. And in the early 20th century, I have heard this is one of the greatest novels of all time, and I don't know why I've never read it, especially since it's pretty small. So I want to read it this year. The next one is the only book I don't know that much about, but the more I learn about it, the more I'm curious to read it, and that's The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ebeneze. And this book was originally written in Spanish. I believe it is set during the war in Spain. And it follows brothers, or these young men, in the battle. I don't know as much about this, but I got this because it was an old book. I knew nothing about it, and I just liked the title. And since then, I've heard several people recommend this book as an exceptional book, so it makes me want to read it more. So I'm hoping to read this by the end of this year. The next one is Betrothed by Alexandra Masoni, one that I've owned since high school. It was extra credit reading in one of my English classes in high school, and so I bought the book for that class, and then I never ended up reading it. I think you had a choice between 2 or 3 different books, and I chose another book. So this one I never read, and I've owned it since then, and I never heard anything about him, the author or the book. And recently I've been hearing so many great things about him that he is an exceptional author, and so I'm like, oh yeah, I should probably read him now. The next 2 are by one author, and I just want to read all of his books this year, but I know I won't have time, so I picked out like 2 more to read, and that is Charles Dickens. I've read quite a few of his more famous books. I've read Oliver Twist and Great Expectations and Little Dorrit, but then I realized how prolific he was and how few of his books I've actually read. So the 2 books I want to read by the end of this year are The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, which my mother read and she said was a lot of fun to read, and David Copperfield. This is considered his best work by many, I've heard. So it will be hard to top Little Dorrit because I absolutely love Little Dorrit. It's my favorite Charles Dickens book. So I'm curious to see how this stands up, but as you can see, these are both pretty thick books, so I only wanted to pick 2 of his to read this year because there's a lot more of his that I want to read. The Old Curiosity Shop is another one, but that's going to be sad at the end, so I don't know if I can handle it. And I don't know much about these books outside of Charles Dickens wrote them. You should read them because they're good. The next one on my list is The Grapes of Wrath. You can't really see the title because this is on it. I should take that off. By John Steinbeck. This is about the Dust Bowl epidemic and this family that goes from Oklahoma, I'm not sure, all the way down to California in the 1930s. The next one is The Complete Essays of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a contemporary to William Shakespeare, and in fact, there are some theories that say that Francis Bacon must have written Shakespeare's plays because obviously Shakespeare couldn't because he wasn't educated enough, which is completely bull, and I even wrote my senior dissertation for my 2-year degree on that topic, the authorship of Shakespeare, because a lot of people think he couldn't have written it. Francis Bacon was a philosopher who was a contemporary to William Shakespeare, and he also thought plays were stupid and way below his interest. So yeah, I doubt he wrote Shakespeare. But this book is a collection of just his essays on different ideas, and I started this book probably about 6 years ago, and I am less than halfway done, but I really just want to knock this out and read it because I've had it halfway done for the last 6 years. And sometimes I'll read like one essay here or there and I never finish it. So I need to finish it. The next one is an old sci-fi author that I have wanted to read for years because I read Hour of the Horde by Gordon R. Dickson. My dad loved that book and he owned a copy, and I just picked it up one day and I read it and I loved it so much. And since then I've wanted to read more of Gordon R. Dickson. I believe he wrote in the 60s or 70s. So I found 2 of his at my dollar book swap where all the books are $1, and since then I've owned these 2. It's A Man from Earth, which I believe is a short story collection, and Space Paw, which I literally got because of the cover. I mean, look at that cover. So I've been wanting to read Gordon R. Dickson to see if maybe The Hour of the Horde is just an anomaly and I just happen to love that one book by him, or if I'll like more books by him, because there's very few sci-fi authors that I read that I'm like, this is an amazing book, I want to read all of his books. Whereas Gordon R. Dickson was like that for me with The Hour of the Horde. So I want to try more of his books to see that if he is going to be one of my favorite authors to start reading. The next one is Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I was supposed to read this earlier this year, I thought. I told myself, yeah, you're going to read this at the beginning of the year, or last year maybe even. And yeah, I never read it. And so I want to read it this year because I read Treasure Island a year or 2 ago and I adored it. Stevenson creates great adventure novels, and I watched the movie that came out in the 50s, I think, and I love that movie. So I want to read this book, especially since, again, it's short and I shouldn't be excusing myself and not reading it. And the last one is Deerslayer by James Fenmore Cooper. This is an extremely old copy I bought, and I love this copy so much, but it's falling apart. So I will be listening to this on audiobook and trying to preserve this book as much as possible. But Deerslayer is the first book, of which I think the second or third book is The Last of the Mohicans, which is the most famous book by James Fenmore Cooper. They made a really big movie, even though the movie was like totally different than the book. And with The Last of the Mohicans, I actually, as a child, had an abridged version of that book, and I read it multiple times, many times. So I'm familiar with the plot of The Last of the Mohicans, at least the abridged version. However, I've never read Deerslayer, which I believe follows the main protagonist, but is set before The Last of the Mohicans and is the prequel to it. So I want to read this year because with June on the Range and me having such a mixed month with June on the Range where I really loved some books and I really disliked some books, I want to start reading more very old Westerns because I think those are the ones that I really like. So James Fenmore Cooper was writing in, say, 1820, so he was almost a contemporary to Jane Austen, which, hey, if I read that book for Jane Austen July, it totally counts, even though he was a contemporary living in America and Jane Austen was in England, and their 2 books could not be more different. Have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!